This is Football at 4.
And Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. It's brought to you by Bet365. Whatever the sport, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. And, of course, Geoff Mosher. It's a Mosher Monday with Geoff Mosher here on Football at 4 on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. And Geoff tells me there is a new Wingstop in Deptford.
No. There is one because you read that, but there's one in my area of Sicklerville that just opened up, I want to say, last month. And that would be the one. I have not been there yet, but that would probably be the one closest to your home base of listeners because Sicklerville is closer to the shore than Deptford or Clementon, which is just 2 towns away from me, and some of the other places you mentioned.
Gotcha. Yeah, I got one of our other producers, Nicky Earnshaw. He texted one just opened on Cross Keys Road, Blackwood Clementon Road. There's one as well. So there you go.
Cross Keys is the one that's in my neck of the woods.
That's pretty close to us. That's pretty close to where our studios are.
Yeah, I got 35 minutes drive. Not too bad for good wings.
Yeah, I mean, I've never had the wings before, so I can't verify whether they're good or not. I mean, I just hear the commercial ad nauseum. That's all.
Yeah, I haven't had them either yet.
All right. All right, Moshe, we got, about 15 days until NFL free agency begins. But today was kind of an interesting start to the free agency because teams made the decision. I want to touch on one of the moves that has not happened, and that is Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard, Derrick Henry, Austin Eckler. None of them will be franchised. Now, I know we've talked a little bit about the running backs, but now that those guys, are you surprised by any of those names not being franchised?
No, I'm not, because if you go back to our last conversation about the running backs class of free agents this year, I felt like they're not going to get paid the way they'd like to get paid and the way some we've seen, a guy like Todd Gurley, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, how he reset the market. I don't think the league views this running back class as special. There are some good players. Certainly Josh Jacobs is a good running back. Certainly Saquon Barkley is a good running back. But I don't believe the league will view these running backs as elite and therefore worth spending the franchise tag money for 1 year. Now, someone might get a multi-year deal for more than what the 1 year franchise tag is going to offer, but I just suspect it's not going to be a great market for the running backs.
So of that group, let's kind of break it down in 2 ways, Moshe. Do you like any of them to say, hey, I wish they would go after one of these guys, but I don't see it happening? Or do you think any of those 5 are legitimate options?
I don't think so, because I still think these guys, Saquon Barkley is going to get a multi-year deal. I just don't know how big of a number it's going to be. Same thing with Josh Jacobs. They're still young, still have good years ahead of them. Derrick Henry, to me, would be a good fit as a complementary back for the Eagles with the great offensive line, the good offensive line, really good that they have, and the firepower around him. He would just have to accept the fact that he is now sort of like that guy, like the way LeGarrette Blount was to the Eagles in 2017. And he'd obviously be a better version. I'm just sort of giving you the idea. He'd have to accept being not the feature back anymore if he were to come to the Eagles, but part of a committee where he's a first and a second down running back. And to do that, you also have to accept that you're only going to get paid like a situational running back. But there still might be a team out there, Mike, that wants to pay him more, right, and give him a little bit more of a role than maybe the Eagles would. But I do think for the skill set and for the need of a bruising running back, yeah, it makes sense. I just don't know if it makes sense beyond the theory of it as far as the reality of it. And then you could sort of flip it and say the same thing for Austin Eckler in an offense with Kellen Moore, where the running back can catch passes and be a little bit of a multi-dimensional weapon, but not the lead weapon, not the guy who's going to touch the ball 20 times a game like he did with LA. So that's all going to depend on what these guys find in the market and what the teams are willing to give them and what roles these teams are willing to give them compared to what the Eagles want. Because there are probably 5 or 6 or 7 other running backs, DeAndre Swift one of them, who are underneath this core that can come in and do some really good things at a much lesser price tag.
Yeah, and running back is an interesting one because we're all kind of just like under the assumption that no one's going to pay these guys, and then they're out there. Like if I was to say, I was having the conversation last week about Tony Pollard, and the person I was talking to was like, the Cowboys will probably tag him. Well, they didn't, and now does Tony Pollard go? And do like these guys, do you envision some of these running backs get into a situation where it's like, I got to get a 1-year prove-it deal, and then that's where the Eagles kind of do their business?
Yeah, I could see maybe DeAndre Swift because he's still young, right? And because he's kind of caught in this market where there's going to be, because nobody got tagged, there's going to be 4 or 5 running backs, all the ones we just talked about, signed elsewhere. There's not going to be like 15 teams looking for number 1 running backs or major, your lead situational running back. So DeAndre Swift might say, look, I just had a pretty good year statistically with the Eagles. It benefits me to try to re-sign 1 year and see if next year, when there are fewer amount of running backs I got to contend with for money, and maybe some teams have more money, I can strike it big, especially if I show the NFL that 2 years in a row I can stay healthy and be productive. So, DeAndre Swift could be one of those people.
And Geoff, the hard part is, you say 1 year prove-it deal. Well, at the running back position, 1 year puts another year of wear and tear on you. And even if you prove it, I don't want to pay you for what you just did because I think you're going to get worse. So they're in a tough spot regardless. So it's almost like, do these guys just kind of try to find the best fit for them? And that's where I know everyone's going to tie Pollard and Eckler because of their history with Kellen Moore.
Yeah, they probably will. And I think, Mike, the situation these guys will find themselves in is I'd rather do more than a 1-year deal, but what if I sign because you're right, every year is a prove-it deal and every year is more mileage on it, but what if I sign, say, like a 2 or a 3-year deal somewhere, but like 80% of the guaranteed money is in year 1? Well, that's a 1-year deal. The agent's going to say that's not really a 2 or a 3-year deal. You might be a free agent next year, or a cap casualty or released free agent, right? Looking for a new spot anyway. So if that's the best that somebody's going to offer you, a 2 or 3-year deal that's structured like a 1-year deal, you might have to compare that to the 1-year deal you already have from your team, where you're already comfortable, and think weigh one versus the other.
Yes, that's a good point there. Geoff Mosher, Football at 4, Inside the Birds podcast. On the latest Inside the Birds podcast, you guys kind of looked at some interesting, valuable free agents, and I think this is kind of like, this might be, I don't know, where do you feel about the offseason in terms of like Howie? Like, does he go out and get that big name guy, or are we looking at more value type of an offseason?
I'm looking at more aggressive offseason this offseason from Howie, specifically to address the secondary. He has to. He needs 2 safeties, Mike, not just 1, right? And I don't think it's a situation like linebacker last year where you're like, okay, I'll get you 2 safeties, and they're the safety version of Nick Morrow and Zach Cunningham. That's not going to work. He knows that. And he needs a cornerback, especially seeing what they do with James Bradbury. And, it's not easy to find a free agent corner because you have to pay the bejesus out of these guys. Like L'Jarius Sneed is going to make a lot of money, right? Now, he might be willing to pay that money. You may have to look at the trade market. But no matter what they do, Mike, he has to be, and I sense that he will be aggressive. This is not going to be patchwork, piecemeal, 1-year deal to everybody to come in and just sort of fill a hole.
Well, you mentioned Sneed. He's a younger player at a position they really need. If you're going to like pony up the cash for somebody, it seems that outside younger corner, would probably be the area you go. So this almost feels like a couple of years ago where they struck out with Byron Maxwell. They signed him, they gave him the big money, and he wasn't any good.
Yeah, which has been an issue for the Eagles now going back quite a while. I mean, they haven't drafted well and developed well at the position in 20-some-odd years, and they've had trouble with free agent signings. Now, they got a really good year out of James Bradbury, but the contract they gave him now is biting them in the rear end. Their best move was trading for Darius Slay a couple of years ago, which, by the way, Mike, came as plan B when they failed to sign Byron Jones in free agency who they threw a ton of money at. He just took the money from Miami, zero sales tax, right, all that stuff. Not sales tax, whatever it is, income tax rate. So it wound up being more in Miami. So this has been a problematic area. And it brings me to a conversation that Adam Kaplan and I once had with Joe Banner, talking about the Eagles' failures in this department at that specific position. And he said, yes, it's true they failed in the draft. Yes, it's true they have not developed it the way other teams have. But you got to at least give them credit. This was after the Darius Slay trade where sometimes if you recognize your weakness, you then have to go out and figure out how you're going to overcome it. And for Howie, it's been trying to either use free agency or the trade market to address that weakness. I kind of think that's a cop-out, but I get what you're saying. And if you recognize you have a weakness, you have to correct it. But, man, it would be great if this team could just draft good cornerbacks early in the draft and develop them for once.
Yeah, no question about it. And that's an area where you're absolutely right. They have struggled to find young guys. And they – look – over the years, Moshe, it seems like for the last 5 years, every trade they made, it's like a baseball GM saying, hey, just throw in a single A, arm that I can just get. Like, they seem like they've just had, hey, give me a Mac McCain, give me somebody that plays cornerback, and none of those guys have stuck.
No, yeah, you're right. The Mac McCains, the Cary Vincents, there was a kid from Arizona whose name for Tay Gowan. Tay Gowan was involved in the deal.
Good pull. Listen, Good pull.
Yeah. I get that, and I think that there's some value in throwing darts when it doesn't cost you anything. That's the industry term. Let's just throw darts, right? They did this at wide receiver a couple of years ago, late in the draft. John Hightower was one, and of course Quez Watkins was one, and then they had another. Well, Quez Watkins, we can debate how good he is to we know he's got issues and deficiencies, but for I think a 6th-round pick, he's going to be in his 5th year this coming year, so he is quote unquote a success story because 90% of those guys don't even make it.
Yeah.
So there's something to be said for throwing darts, but at cornerback, Mike, they've been throwing darts for 20 years and always, you're at the bar and you hit like the window instead of the dartboard, right? Like, the dart gets bounced back to you because you hit it so hard off the wrong thing. That's what the Eagles have done at corner.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. Geoff Mosher, Football at 4. Last week on one of your pods, you guys went over some defensive guys, free agents, and obviously we always tie guys that have ties to a coach. One of them is Andrew Van Ginkel. The other one is Josie Jewell. Those both played for Vic Fangio. Would those be two guys that if they landed here, that Howie would have done a good job?
I think so, because of their familiarity with the system. I wouldn't call them sort of game changers, but I don't think at linebacker, we're even accustomed here to Eagles going out and getting someone you would call a game changer at linebacker. You're just looking for somebody who can play the position at a good enough level that you got from, say, T.J. Edwards or, a couple of years ago going back to Jordan Hicks. Even when they had 2 years ago, the kid who went to Arizona last year, Kaiser White, right? You're just looking for guys who can play. Josie Jewell played in the scheme. He knows the scheme. He's been productive in the scheme. He would, of course, be an upgrade, I believe.
But is that where, do you think the linebacker position is evolving in the league and the Eagles aren't evolving their mindset on it, or not really? Like, we look at the running back position, and I think we might all agree that, you probably don't have to pay a running back. Like, you can find one of those guys, and he doesn't have to be a big pay guy. But is that changing at linebacker?
I haven't seen it yet. Last year in the first round, one team took a linebacker, right? Like a stack linebacker. It was the Lions. It's funny, they were criticized for it too. And I think he had a pretty decent year. But Fred Warner's the best linebacker in the league. What was he, a 3rd-round pick? So it seems like teams are very willing to wait till day 2. Chiefs are a great example. Nick Bolton, Willie Gay, right? Wait till day 2. The Chiefs signed Drew Tranquill. He wound up playing a role for them on a 1-year deal. I think teams are much more willing to try to do that and hope that with great development, you might find yourself a Fred Warner, but more likely you're the Eagles and you get T.J. Edwards as an undrafted free agent and you develop into a highly efficient, pretty good starter. That's still what I think the Eagles and most teams look at the position.
Like, if you brought in a Van Ginkel, is he replacing somebody or playing? Is he a rotate? He's more of a tweener type of guy. So, if they signed that, that type of player, what is the messaging there?
Well, that's a great point because I did ask Greg Cosell this in the Inside Greg Cosell on the Inside the Verse platform that dropped Friday. We talked about Van Ginkel, and what he does. Actually, I'm sorry, the one that dropped today. He's interesting because he came out of Wisconsin as an edge rusher, day 3 guy, I believe. But he had the athleticism when they had injuries at stack linebacker to go ahead and play off the ball and then go back to playing on the ball as an edge rusher. So I asked Greg, maybe there's a thing that can start where you're kind of like the way the corners usually, Sheldon Brown would start on the outside, then move inside a nickel. Maybe you can start this guy as a stack linebacker on first and second down, but then once you get into your nickel, you move him into a rotational pass rusher. And maybe you can use him that way. I think keeping him in one spot probably isn't ideal if he can play 2 spots well. But so I don't know whose one particular job he would take, but I do feel like his natural position is edge rusher. Right. And if he were to join the Eagles, he'd probably be a rotational edge rusher. He's not as long as Hassan, Reddick, and Sweat are still there. I don't see Van Ginkel starting, but he's certainly someone who can rotate in and give you a lot of snaps.
Yeah, and then a guy like Josie Jewell, he plays alongside like Nakobe Dean.
He would play alongside Nakobe Dean, exactly.
So that one would make some sense. The Van Ginkel one seems like you would sign him maybe if you ended up moving Reddick.
Yeah, but again, are you signing him to replace Reddick, or then you're signing him? If you lose Reddick, you've got now Nolan Smith in year 2. Let's say you sign Van Ginkel. Okay, you got Van Ginkel. I think you're probably using that pick you get for Reddick on an edge rusher because now you're really young and raw.
You mean at 22? Position.
No, if you're trading Reddick, you might get a low first, high second. You could package them and move up. I'm just saying pass rusher is very much on the table. It is already because it's the Eagles, but I think you're going to really want to add to that group because, Brandon Graham's older now.
You're saying with the pick you get for Reddick, you think the Eagles would get a first-round pick if they traded Reddick?
The Eagles are trading Reddick unless they get something in the top 40, right? They're not taking a third-round pick for Hassan Reddick.
That's what I'm like. The mindset of we'll trade you, but go find out what your value is. And if they get third or fourth round pick, the Eagles might say, not interested. But then that though, Geoff, adds to another conversation of now you've ticked him off that you're saying we're not going to trade you and we're not going to pay you.
I don't know that. I think that there's a happy medium. Certainly, this happened to Chris Jones, and he held out. And Chris Jones lost money overall by holding out because he didn't get anything other than a couple of incentives. Now, he actually reached those incentives by winning the Super Bowl, but the teams can't absorb the fines anymore for holdouts. So whatever he lost in holding out, I remember reading this, he didn't make back with those incentives, so he lost money. So, yeah, you could take off Hassan Reddick all you want, and he could say, you know what, I'm not showing up until the day before the season opener. I'll fly myself to Brazil on my own dime because that's how mad I am. And you know what the Eagles are going to say, Mike? They're going to say, okay. Do you really think – you've seen their training camp practices. You really think they need Hassan Reddick at OTAs and training camp? Heck no.
Right.
I know he's getting a little older, but the speed off the edge is the speed off the edge. He's not changing as a player. Now, they may say, all right, we know this is definitely our last year of him, and now we're looking at the draft and we're getting an edge rusher and, we might add a veteran like Van Ginkel or something to deepen the crew. But this is why I said there's really no leverage on Hassan Reddick's part unless he wants to lose an entire year of accreditation and salary, which, nobody's done that since Le'Veon Bell, and that didn't work out for him.
One of the things you talked about with Greg Cosell were corner. Is there a guy in free agency that can replace Maddox?
There's a guy that we talked about in Miami, and again, it's sort of you go with that Vic Fangio scheme where his name is Nick Needham, I believe it was. So he's someone that we were just tossing around the name of it. It's hard. You're looking at a very specific type of corner there, someone who just plays the nickel spot well. The Eagles have done well drafting there in the past. And, they'll have Zach McPherson coming back from the Achilles, so he'll get a little bit of a run there too. You know, they've signed guys like Nicole Roby Coleman in the past, Patrick, who am I thinking of? 2017, Patrick Robinson, right? So there might be a couple of veterans, and again, there's probably going to be 3 or 4 guys that are released over the next few weeks. Is there someone we mentioned that caught your attention? I don't remember at this point.
No, not necessarily. Well, the one guy that you guys talked about that I can totally see them signing is like Eli Apple, who was a local guy. He played for Vic, and you're like, yeah, maybe he's the Patrick Robinson, a guy who was a first-round pick, hasn't really reached his potential. I don't know that he would fit, would be a slot guy, but he would be one guy that I wouldn't be surprised if they took a shot on. Hey, he was a first-round pick, yada, yada, local guy, all that jazz.
And don't forget about Isaiah Rodgers. You know, they claimed him or signed him, I forget how it worked, from the Colts when he was suspended all year. He actually, people always say that's a guy who's going to compete at nickel. He was an outside corner for the Colts.
Yes.
Who played a little bit of nickel.
Yeah, we had Andrew on last week, and he was pretty insistent. He is not a slot guy.
It's like people who are banking on him to really compete at the slot don't realize he doesn't really have a whole lot of experience there. And he's missed an entire year of football, but certainly at 5'9", the Eagles will give him a shot there and see what they've got. Yeah. But he just gives you an option that's already in-house that a lot of people forget about.
All right, Geoff Mosher, the Combine is this week. Andrew and Adam are in Indianapolis for the NFL Combine, which is underway this week. And, of course, the draft season will be here, the NFL free agency period. We are inside a month now to NFL free agency. In fact, how many Mondays from now? 1, 2, 3 Mondays is when NFL free agency gets underway. The Inside the Birds podcast, you can get that on any podcasting platform. And, of course, a condensed version right here on Football at 4 on the Sports Bash. All right, Geoff, enjoy your Wingstop.
Okay, well, thank you.
All right, man. Geoff Mosher, everybody, from the Inside the Birds podcast.